Hello everybody and welcome to this month's practice group for contract administration. As you see on the screen here, today we'll be doing the last of our four-part series on mistakes that architects make and how they might be avoided. With that, I want to hand it over to Jim to get started with today's session, as I actually have to work with Douglas, as I think we might be having some technical issues on his end. So Jim, I want to pass it off to you to get started with today's session while I try to help out Douglas. Over to you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and go to the first slide, and I'll say thank you everyone for joining us today while Matthew tries to get Doug connected here. This is the fourth in a series talking about the things that architects sometimes do that are mistakes and how we can overcome those or in fact avoid those altogether. So let's go ahead and take a look at working with our heads in the clouds, and we'll go to the next slide and see the first scenario. So in this scenario, a developer hires an architect to do a multifamily project. It's the biggest commission that the architect has ever received. It's the mother lode. It's the new car, the beach house, everything all rolled into one. She is ecstatic. And so the developer says, you know, all we need, though, is a permit set of construction documents so that we can get a building permit. We know what we're doing. We've built thousands of these units before, so we're going to go ahead and work out a contract with you. We don't necessarily need construction administration services. We got that part covered. So the architect uses a standard AIA contract for design and construct, and the design is completed and the construction is completed. And in a little under a year after the buildings are occupied, the residents begin to complain about water infiltration into their condos. And the homeowners association, of course, gets involved, and they consult with attorneys and other contractors and engineers and forensic specialists. And the decision is made by the homeowners association to sue the developer, the architect, and the contractor. So what happens now? Let's look at the next slide, Matthew, and see some potential scenarios. So does the architect not worry about it? Because she wasn't contracted to perform construction administration anyway, so it's not her problem. Do you just call the homeowner's attorney and ask how much money is needed to fix the problem and write a check? Do you immediately inform your insurance carrier and your attorney, letting them know that there's a quagmire that you might find yourself in at this time? Do you go to the contract documents and see if you can determine how things have gone wrong and what may have occurred in the sequence of construction? Do you call the city building inspections department and start to quiz them about how things went so south and why they weren't discovering these things before they issued a certificate of occupancy for the job? So let's go to the next slide and take a look. What happened here is the contractor installed brick veneer before the framing for the bay windows that were in the project. And the brick veneer wall cavity was not properly terminated at these windows, as well as many other locations. Flashings and leaks were installed, but unfortunately they were installed in the brick below the bay window roof. And that thus allowed water to drain into the interior walls and at the bay windows and into the wall cavities. And this occurred at 560 units. They were all built the same way. So you take a look at some of the damages there. Now, Matthew, if we go backwards to the potential answers slide, is are there any offers out there for recommendations of which or any of these are the proper answers? And I want to say hey to Doug. I think he's on the line with us.
I am Jim. Hello. Sorry, logged in a little bit late.
That's okay, no problem. We're just looking at solutions for number one. So scenario number one. Matthew, any takers out there?
We have a pretty quiet audience so far, but always willing to jump in if we get something. Oh, Rietta just pointed that she would recommend number 3.
Yes. Number 3 is always a good answer. You know, we talk about this frequently, but many of our liability insurance policies don't just recommend that, but they require it. And if, in fact, your first phone call isn't to your insurance carrier, you can often negate the value or even the coverage altogether of policies if the carrier isn't at the table from the very first conversation. So that's a great point and an important first call. Well, Matthew, let's go ahead and we'll go past the photographs to the probable solutions slide. Absolutely, number 3 is a good idea. And going through your documents to see if you can determine how these issues may have occurred would be good homework to do. Is it that the contractor constructed improperly and didn't understand your direction? Is it that perhaps there were errors and omissions in your documents in how you prepared them, which would mean you would certainly want your carrier at the table. In particular for this project, because it happened in so many places, it just by sheer mass expanded the problem on this particular project. You know, you don't, and Doug, you stop me and jump in anywhere here you want to. I will just touch finally that I don't think there's ever a time where you just decide not to worry about something and throw your hands up in desperation. It's always, in my experience, a good idea to work with whatever the issues are that have come up to try to help the team come to an acceptable conclusion to an issue.
I would totally agree with that, Jim. One way or the other, you're going to find yourself sitting at the table anyway. In this case, I would be 100% sure that the homeowners association and their attorney would eventually file a claim in court unless something was settled prior to them having to do that. And if they have to go to court, you're certainly going to be at the table. And if they end up trying to negotiate with the contractor and assume that they come up with a settlement with the contractor's going to be looking to you to help offset some of those costs that he's going to have to pay. And you may end up finding yourself in a suit between the contractor and the architect that doesn't include the homeowners association. So yeah, you throwing your hands up is not going to be to a benefit to you. I would say that the sooner you're involved and a part of the solution, the better, rather than waiting for the lawsuits to come.
Matthew, let's go to the next slide and talk about some of the mistakes, and that may prompt some comments as we talk here. But you know, one of the glaring errors is in the very beginning that just going to standard AIA, for example, contracts or any other standard form of contracts, whether it's interior designers or consensus docs or CSI documents, whatever they are, ABC, home builders, using the improper contract sort of sets this domino effect in motion right from the start. So I'm not, please don't take that as a suggestion that you should write your own contracts, but certainly you wouldn't use a standard form if you weren't going to provide typical services that would include construction administration. And thinking that a large job and a big commission is a good thing isn't always the case. We often find people that get into work that is over their head because they're trying to break into a new market or go into a new direction. And that can be facilitated with teams, with joint ventures. But just because there's a big commission there doesn't necessarily mean it's a good one. And in this case, perhaps there was a red flag that this project said, oh, we don't need you for really important phases of the work. We just need you to get a permit. And that was almost in this case like saying, you know, we only have you in the room because we have to. So there are red flags there that maybe being finally they're more versed in risk management would have kept this chain of events from occurring. Doug, any other comments for that one?
No, that covers it pretty well. Do we have any comments from the audience?
No, at this point we are still quiet here.
Okay. Well, let's go to scenario number 2, Matthew. I meant to fix that. So let's look at the scenario. The next slide. So the documents have been completed. They've been permitted. Construction is well underway. There was just no time for quality control, quality assurance measures to be implemented on the project. And during the construction, all of a sudden you realize that your documents contain errors. Unfortunately, at the time that you realize that these errors are there, significant portions of the work have been completed, and the only way to correct these issues will involve destruction and then reconstruction to correct them, and that will be at no small cost to the project. So let's take a look at the next slide. What might be some of the solutions? Do you just close your firm, give up, and go home because you're finished? Do you ignore the issue and hope that nothing happens during a period of time that you wait out the statute of limitations in your region and hope that nothing occurs from it? Do you notify everyone, beginning with your professional liability insurance carrier? Choice 4, do you begin efforts to mitigate the impact of this issue both in any more time or any more money and find workable corrective solutions? Would you, in this case, issue a stop work order on the project? Or the ultimate decision, number 6, do you go ahead and file for bankruptcy and implement steps 1, 3, and 4 because of the size and scope of the issue? So let's take a look at the next slide to see some of the images, and then we'll come back to the solutions. So again, in this project, which was significant size and scope, repetitive features in structures, the balconies at these units were improperly detailed. In fact, there were limited details at best, and some of those that were shown at the balconies were actually incorrect. And with the general contractor on this project, left to her own devices. The balcony flashing was figured out as best her team could in the field. They were improperly lapsed at the weather-resistant barriers. And so what occurred at every location was significant water damage to sheathing, but more importantly, through the wall into the structural framing of these units. And this occurred at hundreds of residential units. Some of these scenarios I'll stop and say, so Matthew, let's go backwards to the solutions. You often hear about the liability insurance carriers having the primary first question when they cover a firm, and that question is, do you do multifamily housing? Again, because of the sheer mass of issues that might occur, the duplicate occurrence, those are some of the most dangerous projects. But having said that, if we go back to that first scenario and we understand about risk management, there are certainly here in North Carolina some very successful multifamily unit firms that specialize in nothing but that. Anyway, I'm talking too much. So, Matthew, any hands raised there as potential solutions?
We have a couple people that have typed in some numbers here, and we have a consensus for 3 and 4, with about half of the people saying maybe 5, and Jim Carlisle being the funny one and saying that after you do all 3 of those, maybe number 1.
Well, it's a scary business, that's for sure. And all of us that have been around for a while know of firms that have been forced into that option or have come very close. Well, let's skip ahead, Matthew, to the probable solutions and talk about those.
There was one other additional comment pointed out that technically for number 5, unless it's an immediate safety issue, work stop orders typically would only come from the owner. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Absolutely. Doug, you want to field that?
Well, that typically is a true statement. By contract, we are not authorized, architects typically are not authorized to stop the work unless, as was mentioned, there is a imminent life safety issue. You could certainly recommend to the owner that the work be stopped and go to the contractor and maybe request it or recommend that it stop, but you are not authorized as the architect on the project to stop the work. So I think that kind of ties into number 3 where it says everyone in large, all caps, is that you're notifying not only your professional liability carrier, you're notifying the contractor, and you're notifying the owner that this is an issue out here and we need to jump on it right away.
And I think the part of the discussion about that stop work order that is really important, and it seems very understandable, but there are many who do not understand that, in fact, that is not one of the responsibilities of the architect, that it is, in fact, the owner who issues a stop work order. And should you do that by mistake, that sets off another whole set of consequences that would be associated with that project that are no fun to sort out and clean up. And as we've talked about, many times, it's being a team player and finding workable corrective solutions that are the least negative impact on time and money would be a very, very good first step. And if we go Matthew, to the next slide. We're not going to the next issue, but in relation to why we would be taking some of these steps out of the practice guide for construction contract administration and out of documents that define our contracts with our owners. Now, what is expected of us as architects or engineers is that there is an expectation by the team to look at us, the owner, to look at us as their representative, to be their eyes and ears and the overseer of their interests, and to communicate with them. As Doug said, that notifying everyone means that we're talking to the whole team. We're expected to be knowledgeable and professional about the aspects of the project, and that would include the construction techniques and methods. We're not responsible for those methods, but we're responsible to be knowledgeable of those methods so that we can communicate when something is off track. We should be conspicuously obvious during the construction phase so that we are able to see that those methods are within an industry standard. There's an expectation on us to look out for the owner's interest in modifications in budget and how money is being spent, and also to advise the owner for any direction or advice that they may need as they see their project come to fruition. So these are owners' expectations of our services, both in design and construction. I'll pause there. Matthew, any hands raised or comments from anyone?
Yeah, we had one other point brought up here by Brian Varner, who brings up it may be good to also advise the surety as well in this case.
Absolutely. Jim, before we move on, just a comment on this fact pattern that noted that there was not time sufficient to do a quality review, quality control, quality assurance review on the documents. I would encourage folks, and we've all been there where we've had projects with the deadlines there and whatever's happened has happened, and you've got to get the drawings out the door and you have not done a full effort in checking the drawings. I would encourage you to, even though the drawings are out the door and they're in the hands of the contractor being permitted under construction, to go ahead and do that quality review anyway. The sooner you catch it, the less costly it's going to be to fix it. It's easier to fix on paper than once it's built. I remember one time I was working on a project and the contractor had submitted a question. I went out to the site, we were discussing it, and got back to the office to get with the folks that had, it was an individual that had worked on this project that I needed to go to help resolve this issue. And when I presented it to him, the first thing he said to me was, I was wondering when he was going to ask that question. And that just floored me. If you knew there was an issue in the documents, whether it's something that you didn't get a chance to detail or whatever, why would you wait for the question to come to you? There's addendums that can be issued. There's supplemental instructions that can be issued. Go ahead and get the issue resolved before it becomes a problem.
And to go along with that, Doug, it is as the construction, as you're pointing out, as the construction is continuing, just because you're underway, there is no reason that you have to stop in reviewing your documents. Some of the most successful projects I've seen have had teams, construction administration teams on the job site who do coordination, for example, of documents throughout the construction. It doesn't stop until the project has been finished. And so even if you discover that there's an issue, knowing it, as Doug just described, knowing it ahead of the issue, finding it out as early as you can and sharing that as early as you can, it is much more beneficial. So if we take a look at the next slide, what some of the mistakes may have been in this scenario, maybe there wasn't sufficient time scheduled to pull the contract documents together, to let them mature and age and be coordinated. There may have been issues in this project with scope creep, which impacted the delivery schedule for the construction documents. And what happened with a QA/QC time frame was eroded by continuing to develop the drawings originally. And in this case, there wasn't a systematic procedure. You know, I don't know, Doug, if you want to touch on what kind of opportunities there are if you have a systematic QA/QC process documented in your office, even with, for example, professional liability costs. It's an opportunity to save money for the firm.
It is. I believe there are even some carriers out there, depending on your process, they may even give you a break on your insurance rates. But it certainly will be a benefit to you in terms of redesign, issuing work or documents during the construction administration phase. You can get all of that done out of the way. You're not spending time doing it during the CA phase, burn up CA fee. It's a benefit for you professionally and your reputation and your relationships with the owners and the contractors. They know they're going to get a quality product, a quality set of documents from you when you've gone through a good process. So it has many benefits.
It certainly, and also I have been involved with work that where the architect was able to show that in fact they had a documented process, and as things were moving towards litigation for an issue, there's Doug talks about this frequently. There is not an expectation, as long as you didn't create it by saying you are the best or you exceed all other competition in your work. There's not an expectation for perfection. And I have seen firms have a QA/QC process that is a documented process. They're able to show that they took their project through that process within their firm, and it changed the mindset of the other side of the party that, well, we're going to have to spend too much time proving that, you know, they didn't do all that, and they've got this process documented, and they show us the documents that they took the project through it. Okay, they missed something. They're not expected to be perfect, and maybe we need to move on to another item. So I do know that it can be a defensive help if you get into that kind of scenario. And then in this project, there may have been a lack of team management and communication between the documents back and forth, and you know, who in the office was taking care of flashing details and who in the office was taking care of plan views and who was doing sections. So there might have been an opportunity through better communication here within the team itself. Matthew, are there any questions or items we ought to address before we move on?
Yeah, we had one more question here coming from Thomas, and he was wondering what, if any, would be the contractor's responsibility in this case? As the professional installer, don't they have an obligation to notify or question if they think something is wrong in what they're building?
Doug?
They are professionals. They are expected. Is that static coming from me? I hope not. They are expected to know how to construct a building, and they are expected to and obligated by the contractor to inform the architect and the owner if they are aware that there is a problem with the documents. But the key there is that they have to be aware that there's a problem. And if they don't know, and it's not something that they should know, then they're not going to be responsible for your mistakes in your documents, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would add, I have heard responses like, well, I'm a contractor, that guy is the professional, and even though that contractor is very much a professional, and as Doug said, and is expected to be able to build to a standard, I don't know a nice way to say, they've sort of played innocent, I'll use that word, and sometimes it works.
Yeah, they'll say, well, I did just what you asked me to do. I did just what the drawing said that I was supposed to do. I did what my contract said I'm supposed to do. And that would be a true statement. But if it's something that is patently obvious that is not standard construction, then I would expect that they should ask the question before they do it.
It's a really interesting question, and a way to, I would assume, people would begin to put a defense together, based on an issue like that. And I'll use an engineer friend of mine who specializes. His work is in a coastal region, and he works with contractors who are very familiar with building in that coastal region. And so you pose a really interesting question. If you end up with one of those contractors on your job who has built hundreds and hundreds of buildings close to, a certain wind zone and a certain humidity and a certain infiltration rate, and what the viewpoint locations are on a wall, they built a career working on buildings in that area, I think it'd be hard for them to take the defense, well, all shucks, I didn't know what I was doing. So there may be part of that answer buried in the resume, if you will, of the contractor that you've been working with. They may be an expert at that location, and that might be something that you could discover.
And that is another good reason for pre-qualifying contractors.
There you go.
I'm a big proponent of pre-qualifying contractors so that you're getting a contractor that has the experience and the knowledge to work on the particulars for that project that you're working on. And a contractor that's building multifamily housing on the coast is going to have different experiences and the different knowledge base than a contractor that's building high-rises in downtown Houston.
There you go. That's a great point. Well, Matthew, if you don't have any others, let's go to the next scenario. Details, details, details. So next slide there. when you're developing a set of contract documents, there are all of the wonderfully fancy, can't wait to draw, fun details of terminations and end locations and corners and unions and end dams, if you know what that means, and overlaps and underlaps, and the list just goes on and on. And there are so many of these details to consider and provide, but yet many architects leave many of those details out, and they are not well defined at all. In other words, in those messy parts of the documents, we don't tend to spend a lot of time and pay a lot of attention. And unfortunately, when we do that, in the case of this scenario, then those kind of details get worked out in the field by others. And so in this scenario, let's assume that that's exactly what happened. Those details got worked out by others in the field. So if we take a look at the next slide and we look at what solutions might be to the problem of having limited termination, stop, end, overlap, etc. details, how could we handle that? Should we develop solutions as soon as possible? Do everything we can to help the project stay on schedule? Should we notify the contractor that these issues are completely their problem? Whatever they have not done and missed is theirs to take care of. We shouldn't offer any solutions because that's not our position at this point. But we may want to review any kind of proposals that they intend on putting in place before they start to correct some of these problems. And what we'll do is we'll take a look at the photographs here so you can understand what the issues, not yet. Oh, okay, that's good. Let's do that. That's good, Matthew, leave it there. So for flashing, I probably should have put these before the questions. I apologize, y'all. That was an order thing. It would have been better to look at these first. So in this particular case related to flashings, the flashings and weed screeds were not detailed, nor were they installed at their termination points. So the EIFS system is installed without a drainage plane, and it wasn't properly terminated, and it wasn't properly back wrapped where it was terminated. These were just some of the flashing issues that occurred. Let's look at the next slide at windows and doors where there were terminations. The contractor installed windows that were the wrong type. They weren't approved by the architect. The windows specified weren't actually used. These that were used were not intended to be used at a brick veneer wall. So the contractor shims the windows in order to get them to work with the brick wall, and of course that caused the flashing to be improperly integrated at the weather barrier. And if we go to the next slide, for the cladding itself on the building, the flashings weren't installed at intersections of panel cladding and trim. The panels themselves were not attached per the manufacturer's requirements, and all of this resulted in improper drainage being provided for behind the panels. So those are three locations of details of terminations, overlaps, etc., that in this project were not properly handled. So Matthew, if we go back to go backwards to the possible solutions, well, there we go. That may make a little more sense now. So Now we've discovered these things on the project. Do we develop solutions as soon as we can to get these items completed? Do we tell the contractor this is your problem, but we want to take a look at things before you install it? Do we just simply reject materials that are not in compliance and suggest that the general contractor get to work getting the right stuff on the job, for example, the windows, and getting them installed properly? Do we involve all pertinent parties in this process, or are there particular ones that we invite to the table for these detailed instructions? And or do we put the entire project team on written notice that these things are going on as quickly as we can? So let's, while people are pondering that, Matthew, and let us know if you see hands raised. If we go to the slide after the last picture, right there, one of the things we should touch on while we're talking about this is, you saw in those pictures the materials that were being removed, the things that were being looked at were destructive. The work had been substantially complete on some of the project, not all, but it was a big project with phases, and much of it was in its final condition. So what are we doing during the construction phase related to site observations and site visits? Well, first of all, these are defined in the owner-architect agreement, and they are not in the owner-contractor agreement. This is an obligation between us and our client, our owner. We're supposed to ascertain progress, quality of the work. We're supposed to be there at intervals that are appropriate to the phase of construction. And we'll do those visits based on that phasing and not based on what is a convenient schedule for us. We'll endeavor to guard the owner against defects and deficiencies, and we'll keep them informed of the progress of the work and the state of the work. We should, in our contract with the owner, define our site observations and what our frequency and duration will be for those visits. We should always file a site observation report when we are at the site, and we should copy the contractor when we do it. If we aren't in the process of doing these things, in the practice of doing these things for a particular project, then as an example, how could we, for example, execute an application for payment if we're not there with enough frequency to take a look at the progress of the work before it's covered up? At the very least, there's a frequency demanded by our involvement in the application for payment process, and that would demand a certain amount of time on the job site. So this is just a touch on what kinds of things are within our agreements related to site observations. Doug, is there anything you want to add to these items before we look at potential solutions?
No, let's see if we've got any comments from the audience.
Sure, we have a couple here. So one, Barry recommended that we look at 1, 4, and 5. So we'll see that on the next screen. But we have a message here from Karen. She's asking, is no one in these situations, another question came up here as it went through. Is no one in these sessions, these scenarios, reviewing shop drawings? I thought submittals required plans, elevations, termination details, etc. to be submitted.
Well, let me take the last question. That's a good question. There were people reviewing shop drawings, and for example, with the windows, what was submitted, unfortunately, was not the correct window. And let me stop there and say something that I should have said at the very beginning. These scenarios that we put up here, I wish I could share all of the details to sort of set them up. We don't quite have the time to do that in an hour, so I end up leaving a lot of information not included in the slides, and I apologize for that. It would be, it might be that what we should think about in the future is taking one scenario for an hour and going on a deep dive into that. So you can't, I apologize, you can't know all of the history. So in this case, windows were submitted and they were looked at and they were approved with notations and sent back, and they were the wrong window. They were not made for a brick veneer installation. And so in the locations where there was brick veneer, it was the wrong window. In other locations that were a different perimeter construction, the window worked. There should have been others that were other window types that were used for the brick veneer. So the architect didn't catch that at that moment. In some locations in the documents, the proper window was detailed, but in the specifications where the model number of the window was included, there was only one model number type, and there should have been at least two, probably three, in this project. And on some of the drawings, it's I'm sure nobody on this call would ever do this, but there were some cut and paste window details included in these documents, and some of those were right, and some were not. And so the questions immediately began, well, who should have caught this and when, and why weren't more questions asked during construction? And then that evolved into a conversation about how the sheets were divided up on bid day. So did the window person have a full set of documents? Well, contract says they're supposed to, but it eroded further from there. So it's a good question. Were there submittals? And yes, there were, and but there weren't necessarily specific details about the termination, flashing, lapse, overlaps within those submittals. They were very, very simple shop drawings that were cut through the window, and that was about it. And that's one of the most critical items to point out in this scenario, is that, gosh, I don't know if you can have enough details. Doug, I'll stop talking and let you jump in on this.
I want to say something about submittals, but I'm going to wait until we get to the solutions.
Okay.
All right, we have a few other comments that have popped in here then. Coming from Thomas, he says, should have had a meeting at the beginning of EFIS construction and reviewed details, materials, and installation between AE and contractor as a new phase of work commences.
I like that. Absolutely.
We have talked in the past about pre-installation conferences and the importance of those and how they can be of a big benefit to the project. And just to comment on that is to make sure that you've got the right people there at those conferences. So in addition to having the contractor, the architect, maybe the supplier, you need to have the subcontract foreman is going to actually be out on the job at those meetings as well. So he's hearing what the intent is from the architect, and it's not out there assuming it. And so it just helps to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
A lot of times I go to those meetings and you'll have the sales rep from the subcontracting company there. And he's may have some value to add, but what you really need is the person that's going to be out there putting it in, not the person that sells it to you.
That's right. And in a project this size, often there are mock-ups that might be required when you have the extent of work that is involved in this project. That might be another opportunity. And if you include those in your specifications, be sure you get them.
Yeah, and I was just going to add here, a comment came in from Brian saying that you should use an RFI or discuss at a job meeting to clarify and make sure work is performed correctly. The team approach will reduce mistakes. And as speakers said, contractors bring a lot of experience to the project too, as well as manufacturer reps.
That's exactly. I absolutely. That's one of the things that I like about mock-ups is you have the opportunity to have the expertise of the team that's on your job. And I have found far more solutions with the construction team and product representatives when they're at the table to be easier, quicker, faster, cheaper. That's a really good point. They should be there.
Yeah, and there was a comment that came in right as we were switching from last case study to this one that I think ties into this conversation as well, with being standard trade practices affect a contractor's standard of care. So they should question the design requirements that potentially conflict, and knowing that related to the contractors should do when they notice odd or wrong design requirements. They can't just blindly build what's designed or rely on the Spearian doctrine. I think that also points out to this as well. If that meeting happens at the beginning, chances are there's less of that confusion down the road.
That's a good point.
We have one more comment just popped in here from Frank saying, if you have no CA in the contract, how do you justify signing and applications for payment?
I agree with that. Amen. I don't know. I don't know how you can do that, and I don't mean to be flippant about it. I agree with that comment. I don't see how you could, if you're not there, properly support the processing of an application for payment. Well, so if we look here, perhaps we do everything. In this scenario, immediately work was underway to develop solutions for the windows to help find a way to support the project staying on schedule. There were a lot of windows stored on site. How can we mitigate the impact to cost and schedule? And of course, there were some pieces of this, not all, that were completely the general contractor's issue, and it was left to them to make proposals of how to correct those issues. The architect did not author those solutions, but absolutely reviewed them before they were implemented to be sure that they were in moving in the right direction. There were also materials here that were rejected because they weren't in compliance, and the architect issued a report of non-compliance and had some of the materials that were on the job to be removed and replaced. But from the very beginning, everybody knew, everybody was on notice that there were issues and details once they were discovered so that they could be omitted from being installed in future work while the locations where it did occur were repaired. So, Matthew, let's take a look at the next slide. What some of the mistakes were here is, again, it was a timing issue of hurried completion of documents. There was a lack of appropriate systems research to be sure that materials that were being used were compatible with one another in some of the detailing. And there were limited site observations because of the contractual relationship that led to this issue occurring. So I don't want to rush anybody, but we get to the next slide and talk about these three scenarios that we've looked at. First of all, we need to stay grounded and remember that if something seems too good to be true, it just might be. So working within our expertise or teaming up to build that expertise might be a good idea. And when we see issues of things that we meant to fix but we didn't get to them, we need to be direct and professional in communicating how to deal with those items and get things corrected, all the while being sure our liability insurance carriers are in the loop. And finally, details are important. And not only does it help the contractor figure out how to put the job together, but it certainly helps you understand what your intentions were, particularly when it comes to critical points of connections and overlap.
A couple of closing comments from me on the details issue. There was a time years ago when we would draw for complicated intersections and connections axonometrics in the construction documents to help explain it. I would suggest that you've got a situation like that where that information would be helpful to go ahead and include it in the documents. We've done that on projects here recently. The flat 2D section cut, plan cut detail that you draw may not provide enough information, and doing a simple axon could be a world of difference. And the comment I wanted to say about submittals on that last scenario, make sure that when you get the submittals that they are specific to your project. Oftentimes with window details, you'll get the elaborate detail drawn from the manufacturer, supplier, or installer of the window jamb, but then you'll have a generic wall that it fits into, and it may be nothing near close to what it's actually going to be installed in. Those details need to show how the window fits into that specific wall, not just what the window looks like. So make sure when you're reviewing your shop drawings that they're specific to your project so that they serve the purpose that they're supposed to serve, and that's how the assembly goes together.
Good points. Well, Matthew, that wraps us up unless you have items of hands raised or questions that we need to answer.
Just a last comment saying that details better be correct too, not just numerous.
That's a good point. Touche. That's exactly right. They better be correct. Quality, not quantity, absolutely. Well, our next meeting will be April the 28th, which is the fourth Tuesday of April at noon. And we haven't, at this moment, decided what that conversation will be about. So we would really appreciate any suggestions and ideas from those in attendance today to send in and let us know what you'd like for us to take a dive into, or particular items that you'd like for us to look at or discuss. And Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, we thank everyone for calling in and participating, and hope that you have a great month, and hope to see you here in 4 weeks. The next slide will show our email addresses so you can give us any comments and feedback, and we certainly do welcome it. Matthew?
Alrighty, well thank you very much for attending. Frank, you sent in a question. I just sent you a message quick before we shut down for the day. I'll pass that info on to Jim and Douglas, and maybe we'll talk about that in the next session or a future session after that. But I appreciate everybody's time today. Sorry for going a few minutes over the hour, but feel free to disconnect and get back to your daily activities. Thanks again, and see you in April.